Good evening, and welcome back to the Psychology of Organizational Development. This week, we'll learn about successful high-performing organizations and how they work as systems. In the first week of class, you learned that OD is about system-wide interventions. That was the definition that you were given. In practice, it's often more about much smaller interventions that impact some corner of the organization, like team development, like that intervention that you analyzed for your assignment. And by the way, I've been reading some of the assignments that came in. I'm quite impressed with some of your reflections. Now, in this chapter, we're going to talk about interventions that are actually system-wide, okay? OD as advertised. So system-wide interventions have to cover the whole system. You've learned that there are 5 subsystems of an organization. So they cover the design of the organization, the structural subsystem. They cover how you do work, right? The workflow process that refers to the technical subsystem. And then they examine interactions between individuals and groups. And that covers goals and values, managerial, and psychosocial subsystems, those 3. Why? Because those 3 things are all about the purpose and the power of people. OD tends to focus on some of these subsystems more than others, right? Mostly the relationships one. And organizational structure is about relationships. So let's see that, typical org chart over there. Well, those are positions and job titles and descriptions, but all of that ultimately comes down to a person in a position who is making decisions and performing actions. So a person who is doing things. And OD focuses on relationships, and sometimes even a little too much. Like sometimes we don't focus enough on the technical subsystem. But we do that because fundamentally organizations are made of people, and everything happens through relationships and reflects relationships. In a hierarchy, like the one in that org chart, organizational culture basically comes down to the personality and values of these few people on the top. So when we look at this org chart here, who's on the top of the board of governors, can't see it's too small, but say the president and the vice presidents, right? There's a pretty small group. And so when we talk about the organization, we mythologize it. We say the organization values, and the organization wants, and the goals of the organization. And what we mean in practice is the values and the goals of these few people. And then, of course, organizational culture can also come from occupational culture, right? So nurses have a certain culture and firefighters have a certain culture that's based on the work they do. And organizational culture is really the combination of those 2 things. But it still all comes down to people. So in a hierarchy, why is it those people on the top who have the most clout? Well, because they set the tone and the standards, and they administer the rewards and the punishments and decide what the rules are, and basically get the people down the hierarchy to follow along. OD is a systems approach to all this, to group and interpersonal relationships. One of your most important tools for system-wide intervention is survey research and feedback. And that's about collecting data on what's going on in the organization. So surveys allow you to learn about employees' attitudes. They help you assess the state of the organization, evaluate policies, procedures, processes, find out about satisfaction and morale, find out where the problem areas are. And they're a communication tool because they represent dialogue between the managers and the employees, where you can collect feedback from the employees and summarize it and hand it back. Now, this org chart that we looked at here that's a really small organization. Okay, there's like 25 people there. And in a large organization, well, you might have, 5,000 people in the lower ranks? Are you going to hear from them all? Well, it's going to be a report that's put on the president's desk that's based on some kind of a survey. And they're intended to develop an understanding of the problems, to improve relationships, and to find areas we need to change or maybe learn more. Now, the textbook gives you steps in survey feedback that are based on the processes of the Survey Research Center, the National Training Laboratories, a famous part of the history of OD. This isn't the only way to do survey feedback. It's one of them, right? But let's learn about it. So they say that in step 1, top management plans the survey. And I hope that you have a psychometrician on board somewhere. There is an art and a science to developing surveys that are good. That, you know, somebody circles a number from 1 to 5, and the summary of that actually means something, or you're like, okay, average 3.5. What does that mean? But they're saying that the top management plans the survey, and I hope they're doing that with good guidance from someone who knows about surveys and questionnaire design and psychometrics. I added to this slide that there are good processes with surveying, and you don't want to just come up with a survey and then deliver it, because there are probably a lot of issues with it. You come up with a question, you think it's a good question that makes sense, and people get her to scratching their head and being like, what does this mean? I don't know, it depends. So you can use a focus group. A focus group can be used in the survey development process. You can get a sense of what the issues are, so what measures you need to use. You can get feedback on a pilot. So give the survey to 20 or 30 people first, ideally a random sample of people from across the organization, not just the top management team. See how that goes before you roll it out. When you do roll it out, it's done by external practitioners, and this employees have more trust for that, and they might fear retaliation less. Then the external practitioners summarize the data and give feedback to the organization, that means to management. And your textbook describes a top-down approach where you start with giving the feedback to management, and they develop action plans, and this all trickles down to the bottom. I don't know that that's the best way. It may be better to have folks on the ground who have a lot of that practical knowledge to solve their own problems, right? To actually start at the bottom. And then when they can't figure something out, or they don't have the right authority, refer that issue to the next higher level, and then give those folks a chance to figure things out. And if they still have issues, then keep moving up the chain. Otherwise, you're just sort of dumping a slew of results on management, and they might not know what to do with that because they might not have any training in how to understand survey results, and maybe they don't know what to do because the practical knowledge is on the front lines. Well, why can't you do that? Because in this scenario, you're an external consultant working for management, and you can't just go communicate results to the employees in a way that would upset, embarrass, or discredit management, which they may all do. Okay, that's kind of why you're going from the top and then trickling down. Might not be the best way. Something else I want to add about planning the survey. I have seen employee engagement surveys designed in such a way that it shows an assumption that managers, that the IO psychologists that work closely with managers kind of already know what the problem is. They already know what the issues are, and they're like, oh yeah, we're going to use this scale and that scale and the other one. And then they give those measures to employees who are thinking, this isn't relevant to me. This is why are you asking this? But I want to tell you something. But then there's no place to provide qualitative feedback to say, I didn't understand that question. There's no I don't know response. Like I've seen folks go into this measuring something as if they already knew what the problem was. So that's one reason I think that piloting, focus groups, pre-testing is so important. So if survey research is done well, you can get really good results. You can see if your interventions are working. So let's say you have some program. Well, now the fact that you do this annual engagement survey can give you data where you could, say, compare employee satisfaction before and after the program. And you could get results from different units of the organization. And let's say you do your program, your intervention in this team. Well, you could find a similar team that's going to be the control group that doesn't get that, and then compare the pre and post differences between both groups. So it's great to have that data and get it routinely. And, you know, having this dialogue with employees where they have an opportunity to give their feedback is engaging. And engagement can get you more buy-in for change. At the end of the day, feedback has to lead to action. Feedback alone isn't enough. I could collect data all day long and be like, oh, look at these results. Isn't it interesting? What does it mean? You have to go do something with that. Everything has to come down to action, the action that gets you the result. So you can use the feedback to develop action plans, and that would probably involve some other kind of intervention, maybe a consultation. At the end of the day, everything comes down to planned strategic action. And that goes for your survey and your team development rock climbing adventure. So what are learning organizations? This hurt my brain a bit. I'm gonna read this to you. This is the definition from first with the 7th edition, which some of you are using on page 404. The learning organization is a system-wide change program, so some kind of program that emphasizes the reduction of organizational layers. Okay, we know OD values flattening organizations and isn't into power differences. It's okay. That's an OD value. And the involvement of all employees, blah, 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 or OD in general is into employee engagement. So nothing new here yet. In continuous self-directed learning. So it's some kind of change program gets people to engage in continuous self-directed learning. And we think that this will lead to some good results. That's not really telling me anything. That's sort of saying a learning organization is a learning organization. A learning organization is one where people learn. Let's look at the 8th edition. The learning organization is a continuous state of self-directed learning. The organization is a state of learning. Sometimes you like read a paper and don't know what it means, and I'm having that. I'm not really understanding this definition. The learning organization is a continuous state of self-directed learning that will lead toward all good things for everyone. I didn't get much out of that. The most sense that I could make of this without going and reading books on learning organizations, I have a bunch of them in my bookcase and haven't had time to read them. Maybe it'll make more sense if I do. For now, the most sense I could make of this is that there's a pro-learning culture. There's a culture where we think, you know, we could fail, and that's not the end of the world. We'll use that information to do better next time. And that's a good attitude for everyone to have. I hope you have that attitude. But in fact, many people, if not most people, many leaders have this kind of attitude that failure is bad and it's the end of the world and must be aggressively denied. I see that. And this goes back to the reminder that you should dissociate your self-worth from your performances. People who can do that, if you have secure self-worth and you can look at your performance, you can and say, oh, I think that went well, great. And not like, feel amazing about yourself. Then you can also look at something where you didn't do so well and you kind of messed up and you're like, oh, okay, that didn't work, wouldn't do that again. And you're not all hung up about the failure and the shame and I'm terrible. So to me, this goes back to a kind of a maturity skill. And wouldn't it be lovely to be in an organization where the leader was like that and was leading a culture like that? So what kind of values would we see in an organization that has a pro-learning culture? Well, we value different kinds of knowledge. Not all knowledge is in a textbook. Academics struggle with understanding this. Not all knowledge is in a peer-reviewed, published journal article. I was definitely raised to believe that knowledge was something that existed in peer-reviewed article journals, and there's the rank of the journals. That's a big thing. And I was kind of shocked to discover when I was doing my master's research on the prevalence of bullying and cyberbullying in schools, that some of the worst research results were published in those journals. Like, they were tiny biased samples with questions that were really quite poorly written. And I found the best data in the ones that have been collected by school boards, by the schools themselves. So the best knowledge wasn't in those academic journals. It was in what academics disparagingly call the gray literature. That was the best quality. I remember being surprised by that. I had to explain it to people who were not really ready to accept that idea. But there's also a lot of in-house knowledge in organizations. So they have their own reports, they have their own procedures and processes that they write up that become part of onboarding. So you want to value different kinds of knowledge. Have to encourage communication between people with different perspectives, because when one person has a lot of power, have a tendency to think they know everything and that they're right. And the biggest check on our own self-deception is other people. Creativity is important. Helps us see things in new ways, come up with new solutions to problems. There's something to be said for non-judgmental listening. You can learn something from someone, even if they're kind of wrong at the end of the day. That's my attitude towards pseudoscience. The MBTI is a pseudoscientific tool, but I always learn something from using it. It's important to communicate across barriers. A problem in many organizations is that there's knowledge is siloed between different parts of the organization and between different levels of the organization. So you'll see an organization that has a big problem, and the person that can really contribute that and knows a lot about it is lower in the hierarchy, and these folks on top don't know that person even exists. And that person might have the subject area expertise and also a lot of knowledge of the organization, but we're just not talking to them. Then when they say in your book that you should develop leadership through the organization, I said, everyone is a leader. I went, huh, what do you mean by that? Because I see that kind of everyone's a leader thing used disingenuously when people with power describe themselves as leaders, as if they weren't a sort of class privileged in-group. I think what they're trying to say is that everyone knows something. Everyone has powers of perception. They have the ability to inspire others by proposing a good idea. If we're going to talk to each other, then we have to reduce those power differences between members, because the way the psychology of dominance and submission plays out is that the dominant person knows everything and is right, and what they say is true because they said it. So that's going to throw a wrench into communicating, right? When one person into learning, because in reality, that person, there's a lot of things that person doesn't know, and they see a particular side of things. They have a particular perspective, and if they're contemptuous of other people, especially people on the front lines, they can come to a place where they're just living with their head in their clouds, and they have poor ability to test reality, as the textbook put it. And there's also a benefit to having a humanistic attitude that, you know, everyone has some untapped potential. That even if there's somebody that you think is poorly performing, and there's something that they could contribute. There's something they might know from their experience, even of their poor performance. What are the characteristics of learning organizations, organizations that have a culture that support learning? One is constant readiness to learn. They need to be in tune with their environment and ready to question their way of doing things and change it. Remember, that adaptability is the readiness to use your resources to respond in ways that get you the results that you're looking for. We look for the highest quality of knowledge available, and we'll look for it inside the organization and outside and at lower levels of the organization. And the way we arrive at that information should be haphazard. Like, oh, you know, normally I would never talk to a custodian, but I just happen to be throwing out my apple core while they're standing there. We had this conversation, and I learned something new about the organization that I'd never considered before. That's sort of accidental, haphazard. No, that person should be at a meeting or at a town hall. As we were saying before, it's important to have a culture that accepts collaboration across boundaries in the organization. So not only horizontally and sort of the same level, but also vertically. I have a memory from the public service. In the public service, people's job titles come with a code. There's a group that they're in, and that has like a 2-letter code. So let's say you're in administrative support staff, that's AS. And then there's levels of that. And you start at the entry level of AS1, and then you could move up to being an AS2, and maybe it only goes up to 10. And people will know that. They'll be like, oh, you know, that's Tanya, she's an AS1, but that's Ted, he's a PG. That could be a different group. I just made it up. They're computer programmers. I don't know. They have these codes. He's a PG5. And I recall that once there was a conference, and 3 people were to come in to discuss a certain subject. And there were a couple of managers who'd be like EX1s. And then there was a person with technical knowledge of the subject, and let's say he was a PG5, which is lower and in a different group. And I remember a manager who was organizing it being really troubled because they were working on the itinerary, like here's the session, and then there was going to be a lunch. And can we invite the PG5 to have lunch with the EX1 and the EX2? And could they possibly have a conversation over lunch, because the EX1s talk about such different things that a PG5 couldn't understand. Actually, it went fine, and they all had a good time and a good lunch and a good conversation, because actually they're all adults and capable of doing that. But when we're in these hierarchical systems and we're in these parent versus child mode, we don't know that. And we think, well, this person might not be able to have a conversation with EX1s because they're so different. We'll think like that in organizations. Learning organizations shouldn't get too rigid about their action plans, because when you're in a dynamic environment, the action plan you have today might need to change tomorrow. And when you implement that action plan, it might not be in a way that is totally to the book. There's a concept in intervention science called fidelity. So somebody comes up with a program, and these are the steps, and that's what you're supposed to go do. And you're supposed to go implement them with fidelity to the original program. But sometimes fidelity doesn't work because that process isn't quite adapted. Well, it's not well adapted to your organization. You have to do something a little bit differently. And it can be okay to adapt the implementation if that gets you better results. But sometimes people adapt things so far that it's not even the same intervention anymore. And then it can be really difficult to assess whether or not something's working. At the end of the day, you want to take those results, right? What went right? What went wrong? What could go better? And make that systemic, okay? Institutionalize the success. Remember that failure and change something about policy or process so that it goes better next time. Dysfunctional organizations, and remember they say that all organizations they're a little dysfunctional. Okay, this is organizations are made of people, and well, everyone you meet's a little dysfunctional, right? So dysfunctional organizations spend a lot of time on office politics and turf wars and interpersonal drama. Instead of taking all their energy and skill and competence and applying it to the goal and going there like a team, they're turning their energy in on each other and squabbling and fighting and doing these, I don't know, internal department wars. This can be very absorbing, totally absorbing for employees who might just kind of live these dramas day in and day out. Guess what? The customer doesn't care about any of that. The customer wants a good quality service or product that's, timely, that's competitively priced, and occurs in some context where they feel respected. How much do you, as a student, care about all this drama at SPU? You've probably seen the posters everywhere that's between the administration and the faculty unions and who's who in the department and the 5 staff unions and the non-unionized staff. And we spend tons of time on that. And honestly, we're as bad as the Romans for toxic drama, but at least we're not poisoning each other. But you as the student probably don't care about any of that. You wouldn't even know about it if I wasn't telling you. What do you want? Okay? You probably want an interesting course that is useful and reasonably well designed with a syllabus that makes some sense and gives you some structure, that's taught by a competent person that cares about you and answers your emails and gives you feedback in a timely manner, and you want your tuition to be affordable. And as an institution, we don't spend, I would say we spend relatively little attention and resources in that, right? We're, in faculty culture, which is only one type of culture in the organization, we tend to be far more interested in personal success, in who has published the highly cited article in the top tier journal and presented as the keynote speaker at the big conference in Europe. And this article is something that, maybe we'll say, oh, it's in this top tier journal and it's got the impact factor and the citations and wow, but nobody outside academia would even read it, because even if they were interested in that article, it's stuck behind a paywall. And so we spend a lot of our time on things that mean little to nothing to you as the paying customer, whose satisfaction and retention is actually our bottom line. And almost all the revenue here comes from undergraduate tuition. They say work is simplified and made more efficient by eliminating any elements that do not directly add customer value. I see so many projects going on that I would question whether we assume they add value, but I wonder whether they do. We spend a lot of money updating the brand, right? How much value does this new, fresher shade of purple and more streamlined font give you? Or would you rather that money had gone towards, I don't know, offering some new class in a topic that would help you job? I don't know what it is. Did it need to be about the logo? They're sure that was really important. All right. There are steps in the reengineering process, and it's a process that's about process. These steps all focus on process and performance. So you need to know what your work is. For SMU, the key business process is producing undergraduate degrees, getting people through classes. The performance measures, I think my performance measures are my DWF rate. And if I'm losing students, if students can't complete the course, there's something I need to do differently. There always will be a few DFW students, but I'm going to keep that low. And then maybe there's some way to re-engineer the process. And you want to organize your work around what you're trying to do, not so much organizing it around functions. So organized around the actual work. Re-engineering is not for small tweaks, it's for complete overhauls, where you go back to the drawing board, the blank slate. So we need to do this differently. And in step 4, you'd implement your redesign and evaluate it. Notice that most of these processes, they end with evaluation. On to System 4 management, which was devised by Rensis Likert. Looks like it's pronounced Likert. It's not, it's Likert. And he's the originator of those 1, 2, 3, 4, those 5-point scales that you see on surveys, called Likert scales. So this model describes organizations on a continuum. It's actually a Likert scale that goes from 1 to 4. And it frames bureaucratic organization as ineffective and puts them on the bottom. That's system 1. And then it puts your OD ideal of that really participative, collaborative, flat organization at the top. We're going to code that as a 4. So system 1 is kind of what I was showing you in organization B. That's what I called it. They actually flipped it around and they had it differently in the figure, but we talked about that organization in the first classes. And that would be your, assuming that's not a very nice boss, your exploitative, sorry, I'm tired, top-down autocratic leadership style. And the idea that it's exploitative suggests that this is a narcissistic culture. So that sounds like probably not the organization that I'd want to work for. But authoritative, even autocratic systems can work when the leader cares and isn't being ruthlessly cutthroat and exploitative. And I would argue that there are some contexts where that works the best. Then in system 3, you have a consultative culture that is halfway between, it's a compromise between that and system 4, which that's your OD ideal of the flat hierarchy and all the caring and sharing. According to the text, and I haven't fact checked this, system 1 organizations tend to be the least effective, and system 4 tend to be the most effective. And your job as the OD practitioner is to move the organization from being system 1 to being system 4. And when I see that, I think, so when you say that this is the most effective, or this one is the least effective, you have to ask in what context, because context matters. And something I see over and over and over again in psychology is people forgetting context and just being like, this is the best, being positivist. And forgetting that what you really mean is this was the best out of what we could do, right? Given this range of comparison over here at this time. We want to sort of take that and turn it into a universal law, like the law of gravity. Context matters. And I think we do better science when we remember that. I suspect that systems 2 to 4 work in different contexts. And, you know, some really high risk contexts are best managed in a competent authoritarian way, right? Those are situations where there's a lot of risk, where there really is one best way and there's no time or no reason to entertain disagreements or debates. You've probably learned in intro psych that authoritative democratic parenting is better than authoritarian parenting. But actually, when you're in a conflict zone and you're raising your kids in Darfur or in the Ukraine, stop that now and come with me and get inside. Those could be life or death situations, and so people start barking orders at each other, and you want to have the right person giving the orders. But I wouldn't agree that in all contexts, all of the time, you want a lot of engagement and discussion and dialogue. So the common elements of this possibly ideal, debatably ideal system 4 organization is that it's action focused rather than locked in analysis, that the decisions involve subordinates, that individuals are held to account, and that you recognize teams and you recognize individuals for their contributions. This is the scoring sheet that's used to classify an organization from system 1 through to system 4. That's an example of a Likert scale. So you could, let's say, look at this top row here. How is downward communication accepted? Your lowest level, you could code that as a 1, is with suspicion. And there's mild suspicion, that's a 2. Mild caution is a 3. And then readily would be 4. So that's a 1 to 4 scale. And there's some mathematical operations you can do on those numbers when you understand that they're ranks. Looking through this, I see a bit of that. Well, I see some questions that I like. How is downward communication accepted? Well, if it's with suspicion, that tells you there's not a lot of trust. How is upward communication accepted? Well, if it's with contempt, there's not a lot of respect. So I like these questions. But then there's one that raised my eyebrow. And it made me think, oh, they're being positivist and forgetting context there. The question, are there a lot of rules, policies, and procedures a person has to know to get the job done? And looks like a great deal is bad and very few is good. And I question that. Let's say that the context is the operating theater and you're the patient getting neurosurgery. Do you want the surgeon to be following a lot of rules, policies, and procedures? He has to know a lot of things, but before he does this, or do you want him just to be really inspired or creative and kind of there and see how that goes? Fail and pick yourself up again. Don't do that on the next brain. No, I think you probably want him to be following some very, very rigid rules, policies, and procedures. I think what we really are getting at there is not that more is bad, but there could be a place of too much and too little relative to what is appropriate. And sometimes, a lot of bureaucratic red tape can be a source of pointless inefficiency, and maybe that's what they're trying to get at. It's more than you need. On to high-performing systems. Here again, we see those OD field values of the flat hierarchy and the boundaryless climate of participation. Here are some criteria according to which according to this model, we maybe say that an organization has excellent performance as a high performance system. Well, they should be performing excellently against some external standard. Well, what is that? I don't know. It could be money. You're making tons of money. You're producing the most innovative thing, but you have a standard and you're measuring yourself against that standard and being like, oh yes, you're definitely achieving that. You're performing excellently against your potential. Like you'd be doing really well against an external standard, but really you could be doing so much more. Well, you're using your potential, applying these talents. You should be able to look back at where you were before and say, hey, we've come a long way. Other people should look in on this and say, hey, they're doing really well. You should be doing it efficiently because they know what they're doing it. They're doing better than other similar systems, maybe their competitors, and people see them as experts. Like if you want to know how to, I don't know, design a search engine, are you going to go talk to the people at Google or at Bing? And they should walk the talk and fulfill the values of their culture. And there should be something special about them. They're filling some niche. High-performing systems refer to groups of people that have a clear purpose. They have good leadership. There's a high commitment to those purposes. There's cohesion. Right? The teams have gelled and they're focusing on their goals. The group has a sense of identity and opportunities to show creativity. And I will say, though, that it doesn't mean that they live in some ideal organizational world, right? There will be some people in the organization who might see this unit that's a high-performing system as a problem, right? Because maybe it has its own standards, it's doing its own thing. There'll be some kind of politics. The last model that we're learning about in this chapter is the grid OD program. This comes from Blake and Mouton's managerial grid, which is a classic in organizational development and organizational psychology. And it's about achieving excellence by, well, really changing everything. But it starts with a focus on managerial styles. And then it moves through phases that involves lower and lower level teams. I don't know if this works. As I was reading through it, I kept thinking, this sounds like something from a consulting firm trying to sell a lot of these like week-long retreat type services. And I haven't had the opportunity to look into the evidence for this. But here is the phases. So someone in a management position has, read the book by Blake and Mouton about the managerial grid, and they go to a seminar. It's like a week-long seminar at a hotel somewhere. In the next phase, the leader would, who's now gotten some feedback on their leadership style, meets with their own subordinates to work something out. And this teamwork development happens in another week-long seminar. Next, there's intergroup development. So maybe there's some groups that need to work better together, and you'll bring them together in 3 to 4 day sessions. Phase 4 refers to the development of an ideal strategic model. So you're kind of designing the system after all this. And they say that it's concerned with norms, policies, and structure of the organization. Well, I don't see the technical subsystem in there, but it's everything else. And the text says that the key people at the top define what the organization would be like if it were truly excellent. So I'm feeling a little confused because are the people on the top making all the decisions? Are we trying to be participative? What's going on? In phase 5, we would implement this ideal model. And so you have planning teams take the lead for that. And this could take like a long time, like months to a few years. And again, at the end, we'd check back and see how well this is working. Are we achieving our change goals? There is insufficient evidence for the effectiveness of any of these models. They're kind of management famous, so maybe you should know about them and you'll get something out of it. The chapter leaves you with the thought that there's no one best way to manage. Thank you for your attention. Are there any questions or comments? For next class, I will be covering the last 2 chapters of the textbook, chapters 15 and 16. And I will now turn off the recording and be available for office hours.